Hello everybody. So today I'm going to ask the question as to whether dragons are real or ever were real and what they were, if they were real at all. And so for this I'm going to be looking at it from a bit of an analytical point of view, and I'm going to look at all the different possibilities, and then I'm going to sort of work out what's the most likely one. So I'm going to start off with the idea that dragons were real physical beings. We lived alongside them, we fought them, we killed them. Now this idea stems from a number of mythologies and stories throughout the world, and we have very detailed stories from places like Norway, England, South America, Africa, Australia, whatever. They don't all necessarily call them dragons, they have different descriptions. There's ones that fly, ones on land, ones in the sea, and they might well be different creatures, but they're all large creatures. They're all either called dragon or something similar to that. And the idea that we just simply made them up somehow just doesn't seem to work, because if you made it up, you would be having someone else in a different area that's unrelated to you saying, nah, you made it up. And you'd have them saying, oh yeah, these are real, and then someone else saying, nah, that's a lot of nonsense. And yet we have different parts of the world saying, no, these are real. The problem with this is that we don't have any fossils, so no physical evidence of them. But if you understand how fossils are made, it depends on how you die. So the only reliable, guaranteed way to make a fossil is to turn it into like a mummy, that sort of thing. And that's really quite unusual outside of ancient Egypt. And most animals, most people, most plants that die, they just die. Their bones get disintegrate after a while, and sometimes at the time, depending on how you die. If you're eaten, well, there's not really much left. There's nothing to reconstruct you from, and you know, and if you're left out in the open, well, it's disintegrated. Different things take you. So the vast majority are just completely wiped. And in fact, it's been estimated that at least 95% of all ants, animals and plants that have ever existed, we have no fossil record of. That's species, not just individuals, but entire species. So we don't know what they are. So if dragons did exist, they could be one of them. They could be one of the ones that just simply wasn't fossilized. And if we look at how big they were meant to be and how hard they were to kill and how long they were meant to live, but these were essentially immortal beings, at least biologically immortal. We could kill them, but they wouldn't die of old age. And if you believe that, then you have to say, well, what are the chances that they would just get stuck in a bog and die and just be frozen like that? Well, they wouldn't. They were valuable. When they died, we took their teeth, we took their tail, we took their body, and we made it into armour, we collected it. And it was extremely valuable. And being extremely valuable, of course, would mean that we would handle it a lot, and it would end up being destroyed. And so it makes sense that there wouldn't be any fossils. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And another thing I wanted to point out here is that if we did have a fossil, what are the chances that it would actually be shown to people? Well, it would depend on who found it and how they found it. But I want to just acknowledge just very quickly, we have proven that unicorns were real, but it's not in mainstream media. We know that the unicorns were rhinoceroses with single horns, but we have even gone to the lengths of changing the names of one of these unicorns, which is called the Siberian unicorn. We now call an Elastosaurium, or I don't know how to say that properly, but it was a real creature. They're extinct now, but it was real. Zombies is another one. We know that they're real, but we don't even describe that. We say, oh, that's a voodoo zombie or a hoodoo zombie. It's just a religious thing. No, they've proven that if you give people drugs, they will act like that. If you give them the right drugs. It's a drug inducement. It's not something you get when you bite people and all that sort of stuff. It's a chemical thing. It's a drug. Now, we also know that Atlantis was real. We at least have a place for it, which is in Mauritania, specifically at the Richat structure. And we know that it's been proven, and it does not appear in Wikipedia even as a side note. So we have gone to lengths to hide that 3 mythologies have been proven to be true, because they don't agree with the popular rhetoric, because there are powerful people that don't want people to know this. So in a similar way, if dragons were proven in an absolute sense, we would likely hide it, unless it was proven in a particular way. And we have to realise that a lot of things that we thought were myths have actually been proven to be real places, real things, and so forth. So there's a lot of things like that. So that's a bit awkward. And also, so the second story is, well, it wasn't a deliberate lie, but it was people found dinosaur bones and interpreted them to be dragons, and then made up all these stories. Now again, if that's the case, we wouldn't be finding them the same stories all around the world, because we would instead have some telling these stories and others saying, hey, actually these were just bones. And there's no example of people just saying, oh, actually these were just bones, because it's all around the world and it's so many different stories. It just doesn't add up. You would have someone would refute that, because you're having competing regimes that are different parts of the world. They have no reason to all, collaborate like that. It's not like we had a global world order, and even today we don't collaborate very easily. There's certain things. You saw how our global situation happened in the last couple of years. We're fighting against about how to deal with Russia and Ukraine. We just disagree about these things, and we always have. So, and the problem is, if we think, oh well, the storytellers might lie, well, they might exaggerate, they might embellish a bit, but they might not. And we know that a lot of the fairy tales that we thought was all just made up, well, they were actually about historical events and historical situations. Sure, some of them were exaggerated a bit, but the fundamental story behind them, behind stories such as Cinderella or Snow White, they were based on real events, real people, but maybe changed a little bit, but generally pretty much a true story. Because these stories are easy to tell if they actually happened, and then you might change just a few little details and you'd tell a certain version of the story, but you wouldn't completely make it up. And you see, that's the thing, like, if you were basing it just on some bones and you've made the whole thing up based on some bones and some imagination, that's not how storytelling works. It would more be, oh well, you saw this thing that was flying around, it looks pretty scary, and maybe we imagined the fire breathing part, but even then, there are animals that at least fart fire. The bombardier beetle, maybe it's possible, who knows. But, maybe we exaggerated that a little bit, maybe we changed it a little bit. But the idea that we completely made the whole thing up, it doesn't add up. It's not in line with how people work. And yes, individuals might lie, but they would soon be contradicted by someone else. Even if you look at the Bible stories, there's a lot of historical accuracy in there. There's a few things that might be exaggerated a bit, might be a certain perspective, but the general story is true. And then we get to the next story. So the next option is that dragons were metaphysical creatures. That, in other words, they were never real. They're never meant to be real. They're the equivalent of angels. Now, if you look at this, then you say, but they were described as physical beings. But that's kind of how we dealt with previous religions. We just sort of go there and say, okay, well, this is your religion. We're now going to say that your religion's God is our religion's devil. Your religion's angel is our religion's monster. And of course, if dragons were the same thing as angels, and equally the same things as fairies were angels, then you kind of wouldn't expect to see them, because you wouldn't expect to see angel bones. And now I know I can go on about, what about the theory that dragons and gods and angels and all of that were aliens? Well, that doesn't really change the story. If they were aliens, well, it doesn't stop them being metaphysical. They could be metaphysical aliens. It doesn't really change the story. So I don't really need to consider that. So when I look at this, there's really only two possibilities that really make any sense. They either were physical beings, and there's nothing religious about them, or they were religious beings. The idea that we made them up just doesn't make any sense. Does not make any sense. So, if they were real physical beings, we have copious amounts of evidence of this. We have so many different stories, but we are lacking that absolute definitive bit of having a fossil. But again, we know that when we have had that absolute definitive thing, such as with unicorns, with zombies, and with Atlantis, we know that we have lied about it. We've hid it. We've pretended that it wasn't real. And we know that with dragons, if there was a dragon bone, we would probably have whoever would destroy it. Or else maybe even the dinosaur bones really were dragon bones, but we just changed them to look a bit more mundane. Maybe that's what we did, and we added this gap, this millions of year gap, so that we wouldn't have the idea that these were dragons. Maybe that's what we did. We did it as a cover-up to hide the fact that they were real. Maybe even we gone and pretended that we haven't existed for as long as we have, just to sort of have that gap. And maybe they were real. But then, if we look at the religious element, it's just not there. Sure, there were people that had dragons, or at least lizard people, as gods, but they just weren't worshipped to the same level as gods or angels or even fairies to get that sort of monster treatment. So it seems as if the evidence suggests that they were real. Sorry to say that for people that don't want them to be real. It does appear as if they were real. That's it from me. Bye bye now.